Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Cloud Computing for Java Developers.
As you may know, Salesforce.com is a publicly traded company, and therefore we do need to share this safe harbor statement with you to let you know that any forward-looking statements are just that, forward-looking statements. If you have any questions regarding this safe harbor statement, you can find it on our website under the Investor Relations section. So with that, I would like to introduce Quinton Wall.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Quinton Wall. I'm a developer evangelist for Salesforce.com. I'm also joined on the line by Jesper Jørgensen, who is the Director of Product Management and responsible for VMforce. Jesper, good to see you again.
Hey, Quinton. Good to be here.
Yep. So this is our second webinar of the morning and the second in the series of kind of sneak peeks into VMforce. And this one in particular, we're going to get a little bit more under the covers and more of a, like I said, a sneak peek. So it's important to recognize that what we are talking about is there's a lot of kind of future information here. So the safe harbor statement really kind of resonates true in this instance. But the good thing is we're all developers on the line. We like to kind of see what's coming and know what's coming up and get ourselves ready for it. So we've got a lot of really exciting demos to go through and a lot of good information, so I'm going to kind of just jump right into it. So the first thing when we start talking about VMforce and cloud computing is we have to recognize that Java is a well-established language and there's over 6 million, 7 million developers worldwide. Many of these developers have chosen Java as their career, and this is where they're looking to build their future. But on the other side, companies have also invested very heavily in Java. So they've built applications, they've trained those resources, and it's a big, important investment, what technology choice that a company makes and invests their time and future on. So this is good because there's a lot of assets out there built over time, especially existing applications, libraries, and with Spring coming out, there's a large Spring community out there. But that leaves us a bit of a question that we need to answer is, with the rise in the popularity of cloud computing, how do these Java developers start to, say, move to the cloud or specifically move some Java apps or existing assets to the cloud because, say, an organization might be looking towards cloud computing to increase and reduce the reliance that they have on maybe on power usage or consumption or retire existing application servers and so on and so forth. They see the cloud vision and recognize the potential of it and are looking at ways to move there. But the Java developers, companies and assets that have already been invested need to understand how they can move forward. So this is one of the key tenets that we're really talking about in VMforce and this webinar in particular is how can we bring the cloud to the Java developers. The Java developers don't necessarily want to have to or need to learn a new language and start fresh, get rid of those existing assets. We need to be able to work out a way to bring the cloud to the Java developers in what tools they're comfortable with and the processes they're comfortable with as well. So before we get into VMforce a little bit more as well, it's important to kind of take a step back, and especially for the Java developers on the line, you might think of Salesforce as a CRM company, and we certainly have one of the leading CRM products that's out there, especially in the cloud space. But everything is built on top of a platform as a service that we call Force.com. So in particular, Force.com makes the innovation and the rapid innovation that you see coming out of Salesforce possible. And this is also where we get kind of some of that secret sauce for VMforce as well. Now we're going to go into a little bit of detail here. I won't spend too much time because I want to take a little bit more time to look at VMforce and some of the demos and the code, because if you're like me, I prefer to get in and look at the code than spend too much time kind of talking about something when I can actually show it and demo it. But before we jump in, let's just have a quick kind of 101 on what this Force.com platform provides us. In particular, it provides a series of infrastructure services. So I no longer have to worry about servers. These are all in the cloud. Firewalls, load balancing, all those kind of abilities that you were required to get up just to kind of get to the starting block on many applications. But in particular, you have kind of proven reliability. You can go to trust.salesforce.com at any time and see the status of the servers. You no longer get that kind of nighttime call or email or text message saying that a server is down. But importantly as well is, if you notice down the bottom of the slide, we talk about over 100 million API calls a day. It's well over that amount now. But what that means is that, as I said, most people might think of Salesforce as a CRM through a browser, but the reality is we do more API transactions and calls through the Force.com platform than through the browser. So it makes it sort of very compelling, especially when we talk about kind of real-time integration. At the heart of all of this, though, is the multi-tenant kernel, and that's what really kind of sets Salesforce apart in the cloud computing space. We can easily do seamless upgrades to the application because everything is a single instance and a single running version. You no longer have the kind of the heritage issues of customizing a specific version and then not being able to update it. So that's where it really comes into the notion of kind of these operational services that are provided by the platform. You have that patch management that I just kind of mentioned, backup, recovery, system monitoring, provisioning, all those sort of things are available to you, including kind of real-time sandbox or test environments that you can kind of spin up as you need them. And finally, when we talk about the platform, it also provides a kind of a higher level of application services. So obviously, we're going to talk a lot about the Force.com database at this level because we're going to be connecting to it with VMforce. But we also provide the ability for the forms and page layout, so customizable WYSIWYG ability to create and dynamically have created for you a user interface. Now, if you're, say, a Spring developer looking at VMforce, you don't have to obviously use this interface. You can develop it in Spring as you're used to, but you have the ability there, including services like reporting and analytics, user administration. Security is one of those things, and user administration is one of those things that are really core to the platform. So all of that is provided for you in there. But, as I sort of started before, a lot of the people on the line now are Java developers. So I've just spent some time talking about the services provided by the Force.com platform. Does that mean if we're a Java developer, we actually have to kind of go back and learn Force.com? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of what we've been talking about in terms of bringing the cloud to Java? Luckily not. And at this stage, I just wanted to hand it over to Jesper for a little bit to give a quick, brief overview of VMforce before we jump into some more kind of cool demos. Jesper.
Hey. Thanks, Quentin. What Quentin has been talking about up until now is the Force.com platform, which itself grew out of this CRM application that Salesforce.com started with. And over the last 3, 4, 5 years, people have been building custom applications on the Force.com platform using a variety of features on it. These applications have been built using technologies developed by Salesforce.com. And what we decided about last year was we got together with VMware, our partner in VMforce, and decided that we wanted to bring these capabilities to Java. And so VMforce is really an addition to the Force.com platform where you can run your Java applications and connect them into Force.com and use the various services there. What we're targeting with VMforce is a number of different things. First, we want you to be able to write completely new Java applications from scratch. We're working on building tooling support for doing this, plugging VMforce into your existing tooling environment in Eclipse and SpringSource Tool Suite and so on. And we are also targeting not just completely new Java applications, but we're also focused on how can we make sure that as many of the existing applications that are already out there, or existing libraries, assets, existing Java code, can run on this platform. And of course, those of you who've been Java developers for a while know that moving code around, moving libraries around, moving applications around is not always straightforward. So we're not saying that we've found the silver bullet there, but we think it's important that this is part of our objective as well, is to help companies that have existing applications running and are interested in trying to move these to the cloud as part of a cloud strategy. And then finally, we have a large customer base of CRM customers and customers who have built other types of applications or Service Cloud customers on Salesforce. And we wanted to offer these customers the ability to extend these applications and customize them further using Java. So these are sort of the 3 different categories that we're looking at when we're building out VMforce. Let's take a look at how VMforce works. I think this will be pretty useful to understand what you can and cannot do and what the experience will be like building applications for VMforce. the first decision we made was that we wanted it to look and feel as much as possible as how you build Java applications today, and more specifically Java web applications. So you start by building a Java web application in exactly the same way as you would today, and you package it up in a web application archive, which is the standard Java way of packaging web applications. Today you would deploy this web application in maybe a local Tomcat or Jetty instance, basically a standard space servlet container. You can deploy that on localhost for your debugging purposes, run it from inside Eclipse, for example, and be in debug mode, or you can deploy it to some server that you have running in your enterprise. You do exactly the same thing in VMforce. VMforce contains what you'd call a JVM cloud, where we run multiple JVMs for each of the tenants. We can run multiple JVMs for a single tenant as well. So your Java web application will get its own JVM and its own servlet engine. That means that the application will behave and feel much like it does if you deployed it on-premise. That's very important. Now let's talk about how this application is connecting to Force.com. Those of you who know a little bit about Force.com and what Quentin explained here on the last couple of slides, you know that Force.com is a set of services. It's a place you can store data. It's a place you can have a UI. You can have users interact, create data, read data, share data, and through that, basically get an application experience. So for a second, if you can imagine splitting up Force.com and think just about the database part of it, that's what we're exposing to your Java web application through JPA. What that means is that you're essentially using Force.com as a standard relational database seen from your Java web application, and you can use JPA, Java Persistence API, to write your persistence code in Java, and that means that your code becomes independent of Force.com and becomes more portable. That's one of the things we're building for VMforce. And you take advantage of the relational nature of our data store. If you've have had any experience with it, you know that we have this thing we call custom objects, which really just correspond to tables in a database. You can relate these custom objects in master detail relationships or lookup relationships, which corresponds to relationships between tables in a database. And all this can be exposed up in JPA. So that's one of the things that becomes available to you. Then the rest of Force.com is really a set of services that operate on top of the data that's stored there. And that means that when you store your data from your Java application in Force.com, all these services become available to your application. And a good example of this is search indexing. We have free text indexing on all data that's stored in Force.com, and it works out of the box. You don't really have to configure anything. That means if you're building a web application right now, you define an entity, you store your data in Force.com, it will be automatically indexed, and you can perform searches through the API. The same thing is the case with chatter collaboration. We've been talking a lot about chatter over the last almost 1 year now, and the reason why we think it's so essential, or what we've done with our platform because we think it's so essential, is we built chatter at the data model layer. That means that your Java web application, you create an entity, you have your data model in Force.com. Your data model is automatically enabled for collaboration. You can subscribe to feeds. You can subscribe to changes on data that your Java application manages. So that's really what we think is sort of the secret sauce of VMforce, that you get an environment where you can write standard Java web applications that has a persistence layer where you take advantage of all the services that come out of the box with Force.com. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're building with VMforce and how the architecture works underneath the covers. And with that, I'll hand it back to Quentin to talk a little bit more about Force.com and show some demos.
Thanks, Jesper. So one of the things that Jesper spoke about a lot was the Force.com database. Now we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking on the persistent side of things, in particular through Java and JPA. We'll kind of just briefly touch on some of the services that are available, Chatter being one of those, and I'll demo it very briefly, but I really wanted to give as much of a sneak peek as I could in terms of the Java developer's experience for using VMforce, especially in terms of GPA, as we spoke about before. But if you boil a lot of things down, in the beginning, everything comes back to data. How do we capture the data that we want? Maybe how is it related? Jesper had spoken about the relationships and the ability to kind of traverse those relationships. But also, what am I going to report on? Who's going to have access to it? So security has to be controlled and managed on there. But fundamentally, first, and this is where I wanted to spend a bit more time as well, is how do I connect to that data? So when we're talking about the Force.com platform, we have a number of options. So we have Web Services API, which is kind of a SOAP-based connectivity approach that is one of the most popular approaches at the moment. If you're doing kind of high-volume data loaders, the Bulk API is another way that you can load large data sets very quickly. We've also announced in an early access approach the REST API. So REST gives you the ability to do HTTPS connectivity without the requirement of, say, additional toolkits or libraries or anything. It really kind of opens up the way that people can connect to Force.com database, and is kind of very hot in the developer community at the moment. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on REST, but I wanted to spend a little bit more time on JPA, specifically because that's how VMforce is going to be connecting to the data. So let's just look at REST quickly, and then I promise you we're going to jump into some code, because that's kind of the fun bit of all of it. So REST, as I mentioned, is out in early access preview at the moment. And really when we're talking about REST, how it operates inside Force.com is there's kind of a four-step process. The first is obviously you need to authenticate. And we certainly support a number of ways to authenticate on the Force.com platform. OAuth 2 is now supported within the platform as well, so that's certainly the preferred way to connect, and you'll see a lot of samples on those things coming out as the REST becomes public and goes out of early access. The other thing worth mentioning very briefly here as well is the Force.com platform works on metadata, so you'll notice kind of in some of the operations you can describe things. So for instance, if you want to describe an object, and as Jesper mentioned before, when we talk about objects inside the platform, you can think of it analogous to a table with relationships. So if I do a describe, I'm actually accessing the metadata so I can see information about that object. So it might be a customer object. I can see the fields, so on and so forth that are available there. I can do anything. I can access any of the metadata on any of the other aspects of the platform, which, as I mentioned, we won't go into too much detail on here, but there's certainly a bunch of resources available on developer.force.com. Finally, the good thing to know is the response in REST. You can either choose XML or JSON, and JSON is certainly very, very popular at the moment, so it's good to know that you can get that information back and kind of work the way that you're used to working. But if you're like me, I like to look at code and I like to do demos, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to something that should look pretty familiar for a lot of Java developers. I'm in my Spring Source tool suite. So this is what you as a Spring developer or Java developer are typically used to seeing. It's an Eclipse-based IDE. And what I'm looking at right now is a simple controller. The important thing to look at is if you have a look at this line here that I've just highlighted. I'll zoom in just a little bit as well. What I'm actually doing here is I'm using JPA to do a query for contact. And a contact is a standard object inside Salesforce, and I'll describe the notion of standard objects versus custom objects in a little bit, but you'll see the query that we're using is using a language called SOQL. It's a very SQL-like language, so you see that the syntax is very similar, but it gives you the ability to traverse relationships, as an example, inside the platform. So I can go via the object-oriented approach and traverse, say, those lookup relationships that Jesper mentioned before. So at this point, everything looks just like you're used to and comfortable within Java. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually run this little guy, and I'm going to deploy it onto my local server. And what it's going to do is it's going to retrieve a list of contacts, first name, last name, from the Force.com database. So I'm deploying locally and connecting to Force.com database in the cloud. Let's just give it a moment to start up and appear. Almost up. So the nice thing is I'm working just the way that I work as a Spring developer. I haven't had to do anything to connect to Force.com different. I'm using JPA to connect. So here we go. What I've done is I've gone out to Force.com database. I've retrieved a list of first names and last names, you can see here, and got that information from Force.com. So that's good. I can work exactly the way that I'm used to working at the moment with Java, but I'm starting to connect to the cloud. So we covered a few things when we were looking at that application. So we connected to a contact, which, as I mentioned, is a standard object. So at that stage, I just kind of wanted to step back for a second and give a very quick kind of Force.com database 101. As I mentioned, and Jesper mentioned it before as well, Force.com, the database works in an OO design approach. So if you're used to thinking of tables, when I talk about an object, a table is analogous. An object is analogous to a table. So if you think of Spring Travel, which is an application a lot of Spring developers are comfortable with, you have the notion of a hotel, a booking, customers. Those are all objects and can be objects within inside Force.com platform. So you also notice here that I've got a couple of objects here, account, contact, user, in a different color. They're what we call standard objects. So standard objects in the platform are things that are provided for you. Depending on what edition of Salesforce you have, you may have access to certain other standard objects and not different standard objects. But user, for instance, is one of those that you will use relatively heavily because that's how you provision users within inside the cloud, give them access to Force.com. So if we jump in quickly and have a look at what that looks like with inside Force.com, I'm logging into a Force.com org, or an instance of Salesforce. So for many people, this is kind of the first time you may have actually seen this interface. So I'll go into some of the more details soon, but I just wanted to show you quickly what these objects look like within inside Salesforce. So you'll notice here I have a number of custom objects, so accounts, contacts that we spoke about before. But I also had the ability to create, standard objects. I also had the ability to create custom objects, as we mentioned before. So you'll see here I have booking, customer, hotel, the kind of standard Spring Travel type objects that have been created. I can go in and have a look at the fields that are available. For instance, check-in date, check-out date, so on and so forth. And all of those I can display and get rendered as tabs and the user interface generated for me. So that's a kind of a super quick overview of the Force.com database. The last thing to mention, the naming convention, if I'm creating a custom object, and we'll see an example of this soon, ends in __C. So I know if I'm working with, say, a custom object or not. And we'll see that inside Java, just how it kind of makes a difference and how we can use that in a minute. But right now, I wanted to kind of jump back to my SDS IDE, because as we said at the start of this demo and the call, we want to bring the cloud to Java developers. So we want Java developers to be comfortable with the tools that they're familiar with. So for instance, what happens if I wanted to create a new entity or a new object? Do I need to go through the browser to create that, or can I do it in Java? Good news, and this is kind of my favorite demo of all of them in here, is I can do that just natively as I do now through Java. So I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call it Review. Like any good demo, I have saved my code already, just to save us time for pasting this in. And so what you'll see here is this is a standard kind of Bojo entity within inside Java. I've given it two quick fields, review subject, review description, created the accessor methods, and at this stage, it's all just plain vanilla Java. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy that again inside our application. We'll give it just a minute to deploy. So as I said, we've just created a very standard entity called Review. So if you're booking into a hotel, for instance, you might want to leave a review afterwards so management can see and get some feedback on what happened, to make sure that, say, service level agreements are good, customers are happy, you get that feedback. And of course, using some of those application services, we might be able to report on that information as well. I'm just going to give this another minute or so, hopefully a little less to deploy. There we go. Okay, so it's deployed Now, if I jump back to my browser, remember we looked at the custom objects before? We can now go in and we'll see our review objects being created. And I created that via Java, and it was injected into the Force.com database via the JPA adapter. So I'll just click in, and here's our description and subject that were created before. As you see, the API names, which is the names you use to access things via the code, have the __C kind of signature, so you know that they're custom objects. The field labels, we can certainly go in and change and do what we need in there, as well as the API names if we wanted to. So that was kind of a quick kind of cool demo of the fact that I can work with inside my IDE just the way I'm used to and comfortable, and still have things happen inside the Force.com database. For instance, as we did just then, create an entity. But Jesper kind of alluded to it before as well, that there's much more to the Force.com platform than just the database. There's a series of application services that we spoke about before that's really kind of the secret sauce, that you put all these things together, and then VMforce is a really compelling option for Java developers to move to the cloud. So we spoke about search just a little bit before. I mentioned the ability to have automatically generated UI. You can also create them via, say, in the VMforce world, via Spring and the Spring web flows and have those deployed. There's drag and drop reporting and custom reporting and all those sort of things within inside the platform. We don't have too much time to kind of go through a lot of those now, but there's plenty of information on the website, and we can follow up with any questions about that. But I did want to spend just a few seconds on Chatter, making your applications collaborative. This is a kind of a big thing that's been coming out recently, and very powerful notion of being able to collaborate with colleagues and follow information and track information. So as Jesper said before, Chatter is inherently part of the platform. It's not something that you have to do kind of special to make things enable. So let's have a look, for instance, at our review object that we just created. So let's say we've literally just created our review object, and what I'm going to do is I want to make that Chatter enabled or socially aware. All I need to do is go very quickly into feed tracking, go to my review object right here, and enable the feed tracking. So that way, let's say if I decide that any time that somebody changes a subject line, I want to know about it. And the really interesting thing there is that what I can do is I can then start to see information happen and occur by following not just people, but by records as well. So let me just add another one so I can save a little bit of time. And I'm going to enable, say, something on my, my hotel as well, as an example. So let's say if I change the hotel name, I want to know about it. Okay. So I'm going to go to my hotel. I'm going to go to the check-in. The check-in is certainly one of the ones that I prefer to stay away from when I'm booking into a hotel. But very similar to Facebook and things like that. So I can quickly, easy follow a record, share information, and make changes quite easily, all within inside the interface. But as I said, it's all point and click and enabled for you as an application service within inside the Force.com platform. So you inherit that information and that kind of secret sauce as we spoke about before. So that's just kind of a quick overview on Force.com services. But in addition to those services, you get a vast amount of logic abilities to create and manage information like required fields, the ability to create formula fields, which are pretty well spreadsheet-like formulas that are a type on an object or an entity that you can create, for instance, to do simple calculations. There's workflow and approval built into the platform as well that you can take advantage of. But there's also, if you need to go kind of a little bit deeper, there's procedural logic using Apex code, which we'll show an example of soon, which gives you that kind of like event lifecycle ability to attach to via a trigger. You might on insert or on update of a record, you might want to do something in particular, and you can do that via Apex code. And we'll show that in a little bit how close it is and similar it is to something like Java that people on the phone are certainly used to. But again, let's jump into the code. And what we want to see is how it's managed and how it can be done from a Java perspective, and the Java developers feel comfortable with how they're working and how they're managing their time and their development. So let's go back to our review object that we created before. I'm going to go down to my review object here, objects, and review. And what we've decided as a business rule is that subject is now a required field. We don't want somebody to save the information without including a subject, which makes a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click on the required attribute and save. Now the important thing to note here is, although I'm doing it via the browser in this instance, the platform enforces things like required fields and validation consistently, regardless of which way you interact and connect with the database. So with Force.com, so we spoke about the Web Services API, REST, JPA, so on and so forth. The required field and validation is enforced consistently now, regardless of which way I go through. Just because I set it via the browser doesn't mean that if I create something and change something with inside, say my Spring project, it's going to be enforced consistently. So I created a little controller before, and what I can do is I made just a little bit of code here to save some time. And I'm going to create my review object. I'm going to give it a description, and then I'm going to persist it. So this should look very similar to anybody that's worked with JPA previously as well. But you'll notice here that I've commented out the subject line as well. So when we persist this, our validation rule should kick in and give us an error and complain that a required field isn't there and available. So let's run this again and deploy it. Let me just make sure that I have everything right here. So let me go and run and deploy that now. Now I didn't spend too much time on creating the user interface and making that look nice and attractive, but once we finish deploying, we'll be able to try and persist this object and see that that validation rule is enforced consistently across. Let's just give it another moment to appear. Okay, so here we go, here's our application, and let's just go to the controller, and here we go. What you'll see is, as I said, I didn't make it pretty, but you'll see that our error message has been displayed correctly. So our required field review subject is missing. So as I mentioned, we can set it via the browser, but it's enforced consistently regardless of which connectivity method we've used to actually connect to the Force.com database. So that's that kind of additional services on top of just pure data access and data storage that we were talking about before. Now I mentioned before about Apex. For many people, Apex is kind of something new. It's a new language that's sort of tightly integrated with the Force.com database in the sense that it can actually manage and work with the event lifecycle inside the Force.com platform. So, for instance, I can perform actions with a trigger on a before update or an after delete. It's a strongly typed language, very, very similar to Java, and this is why I wanted to kind of demonstrate it and show it to you as well, because there will be times where, say, for instance, you might want to use Apex to do some development. So we want to make sure that that experience is as similar and comfortable as people are used to as well. So I'm going to go back to STS as well here, my IDE, because all I need to do is, in a common similar environment, I've now jumped across to a trigger that I created before. So you'll see that this trigger works on our custom object, the booking object, and it occurs after insert. So when I create a booking, this logic is going to be executed. So the logic here, for instance, is working on the notion of if I create a booking for a particular hotel, I want the available rooms on that hotel to decrement. So let's go and have a look at see how a trigger like that might actually look and operate within inside the platform. So let's go and have a look at our hotels. I'm going to pick the Highlands Inn here, a hotel near home for me, and we'll notice here that the available rooms is at 45. Now let's go in and make a booking. I'm going to create a new booking. I'm going to select a customer that I have any available. Barney Rubble loves to stay there. And I'm going to choose Hotel of the Highlands Inn. I'll leave the rest of the information, just put a check-in date, and I'm going to save that. Now what I can do is I can click into the Highlands Inn, and you'll notice here that the available rooms has decremented. So our trigger has been performed after insert of that record. And that trigger, as I said, is written in Apex, but the syntax is very similar to Java. So if you have the need to write something in Apex, the logic is very similar, the syntax is similar, so the learning curve should be very, very small from that aspect. The last thing that I wanted to end up with in our kind of very quick run-through on the Force.com platform and the sneak peek on VMforce is everything that I've been doing up until now, I've been developing locally and connecting to the Force.com database. So you'll notice that if we look at our servers down the bottom here, I've been deploying everything to my TC server, my Spring TC server on localhost and connecting to the Force.com database in the cloud. But VMforce makes it very, very easy to be able to deploy your Spring apps into the cloud. You'll notice down the bottom here that I have a VMforce cloud running at the moment. And if I want to deploy my application into the cloud instead of after, for instance, finishing my development locally, all I have to do is drag and drop it into the cloud. There we go. And I can just right-click and start my application, and away I go. So that certainly makes it very, very easy to deploy my Spring apps into the VMforce cloud. The approach is consistent, and everybody kind of knows the way that it works. You don't have to learn something different or magical just to deploy it to the cloud as you would. So at that stage, I just wanted to kind of bring it back and take a few minutes to think about what we kind of went through. I know there was a lot of information that we went through, but in particular, VMforce is kind of enabling Java developers to reach the cloud, but very importantly, we're bringing kind of the cloud to the Java developers. The experience should be very similar. By the support of the Spring framework, there's a lot of Spring developers that are already out there and available. VMforce lets us take advantage of the existing Java assets that have been developed inside an organization, and we can start to deploy those things to the cloud. But as we mentioned before, VMforce is more than just the Force.com database as a persistence layer. Force.com as a platform provides a number of other additional services. So we looked at search and reporting, things like those. So we only really just kind of touched the surface on there. But that's what makes VMforce so compelling. You get not only the kind of the Spring and the Java experience that you're used to and comfortable with, but you leverage the Force.com database as well as all those application services that are sitting on top. And of course, the connectivity, you can have it in any number of ways. We looked at JPA because that's the primary approach for VMforce, but REST, for instance, is a very good option for a lot of people, especially when they're looking at mobile apps and HTML5 apps and things like that. So the Force.com platform supports all of those. So as I mentioned, we've really only kind of touched the surface on a lot of these things. I wanted to give you a chance to have a bit of a sneak peek in what VMforce is going to be like, the development experience. As we mentioned at the start, still early days and things are certainly changing and evolving. But I wanted to give you that kind of experience and know and understand how the platform and how things work with inside the platform. If you want to learn more about Force.com, the best place to do that is to go to developer.force.com. And we've created, if you're new to the platform, we've created a landing page that the URL is here. But if you want to build your kind of first cloud app, go there, learn about the platform and the services. And I certainly recommend taking some time and looking at the Force.com workbook and cheat sheets that are available. We've also set up a page for learning more about VMforce, so developer.force.com/VMforce. It gives a really good kind of introduction to Force.com database as an article that's been written and provided, and we're also collecting as many questions as we can through these webinar series and producing them into an FAQ, so frequently asked questions that people are coming up as as VMforce evolves, it certainly helps us to get the information and the feedback from you, and we'll make as much as we can public. But also, the best thing to do very often is attend a live event. Spring 1 is coming up in October. We'll all be there, and we'll be presenting some more information and some deep dive information about VMforce. But shortly after that, Dreamforce is going on as well, and we'll definitely be doing a lot more kind of hands-on information and presentations about VMforce at that stage. So I wanted to make sure that we spent enough time for questions and answers, because what we've found in the last few sessions is there's a really active kind of community out there that wants to know more and have a bunch of great questions. So at this stage, I wanted to kind of finish off and say thank you before opening up to the Q&A section, but if you can please take some time and fill out the URL here. Your feedback is really important for us to understand going forward how we can get the right information out to you in the right format. So just spend a few minutes on the survey there, but at that stage, I want to kind of open it up to some questions and answers, because I know, Jesper, we were on the call earlier today, there was certainly a lot of really good, really valid questions that we wanted to cover. So I'm just looking at some of the questions now. Is one of the good questions, Jesper, that has, I want to ask if I can do something where I don't have a web app. Suppose I just have a complex batch process and find it better to code in Java. Can I have the Apex call web service in VMforce, or is there another way to do it?
That's a good question. We didn't demo that explicitly here or talk much about it, but that's certainly a very important use case for VMforce as well. We expect many of you wanting to write integration-style applications, and these apps can be hit maybe from an on-premise application where you connect to your VMforce application and the VMforce application connects to Force.com, or it can go the other way around where Force.com makes calls to your VMforce application and your VMforce app then makes calls to other systems. That's certainly something we support.
We covered that one a little bit in our first webinar as well, where we're looking at kind of some of the use cases that maybe a Force.com developer might want to connect to Java or take advantage of an existing asset, and integration is one of those ones, or maybe complex business rules and processes, another one that's already built inside Java. That's a great use case. What about, let's say, can you access the Salesforce metadata API through VMforce?
And the very short and quick answer there is yes, you can. We talked a lot about JPA on this call because that's one of the new things we're developing for VMforce, but it's probably useful to understand that we're building this on top of our existing Java libraries, which allows you to connect to our standard Force.com APIs using our partner connection, enterprise connection, or metadata connection. So that's all in there, and we're providing, as part of the SDK, a way for you to set up a metadata connection using dependency injection. So it should be very straightforward to perform metadata API calls with VMforce.
Yep. So we also kind of touched on the REST API. You can do describe calls, which is obviously interrogating the metadata as well. So plenty of ways to be able to do that, which is good, because that's kind of the secret sauce and the real power of the platform as well. Here's another good question that I saw. Can I embed or link to a VMforce application page from a Salesforce page layer? In other words, can I define a button and links to Salesforce to navigate to VMforce?
And then that's another good question. It's a variant of the integration question where you can think about having a user sitting mostly in the Salesforce UI and a developer wanting to enhance this UI or add some functionality to it written in Java. And that's another important use case for VMforce. You will be able to do this, and we're working on making it easy to configure these things. So it's very easy for you to define a button that says, when somebody clicks this button, execute this, send a request to this service in my VMforce application.
So these questions are kind of really good, and this is where I find we get so much information out of talking to people on the webinars and in conferences, because people are thinking about things in different ways and how VMforce can use it. So that information is certainly helpful and valuable. As I said, this is kind of early in the VMforce lifecycle, so the more information I think we can help Jesper, the better. So here's a good one as well. does VMforce fully implement what's defined in JPA? In other words, are there any limitations in JPA running on VMforce?
And the answer there is that, yes, we'll have 100% of everything JPA specifies implemented. No, just kidding. Actually, we won't. JPA is a very big specification, and not all of it will map to what makes sense for Force.com. So we will not be able to implement the full JPA spec. We'll, of course, document exactly what is implemented and what will not work. At this point, it's still too early to get into exactly what the limitations will be. But one way to think about this is that VMforce doesn't fundamentally change what the Force.com service is. The Force.com service can be modeled fairly well from JPA today, particularly with a few extensions here and there. But not everything can be modeled, and initially we're targeting to implement the part of JPA that we can model, where Force.com can be modeled, but we will look going forward at how we can enhance the Force.com service itself to implement even more of sort of the standard view on what a database looks like.
Great. So before I jump into the next question, I want to make sure I address this so people don't think we're ignoring the question. It came up a number of times, and it has previously, in terms of what are the governor limits going to look like in VMforce. And certainly check out the FAQ that we mentioned before, because we've tried to address as many of those questions inside there as we can. So I just wanted to call that question out to make sure that people weren't thinking we were sort of overlooking that question, because it's a really valid question to ask, and it's been answered on the FAQ, so certainly check out those there as well. But here's a good one as well that I think I can answer this one as well. So during the demos, I created the review class and deployed it. But then I created the validation rules, for instance, inside the browser. Now, can we create those inside Java? And the answer is yes, it's going to be possible, as well as the ability to create relationships and those sort of things that you're used to and comfortable with in Java. Just for time, I streamlined the demo and made it pretty simple as I could to get through everything. This is another one that's come up before as well, Jesper. What's the latency and throughput that can be expected from VMforce to the Salesforce API?
And I think we mentioned this before, that the VMforce service is hosted inside Salesforce data centers. So if you look at it from a network topology perspective, it'll be sitting very close to the database tier. It will still communicate with the database tier over the standard API, so it'll still use HTTP and the sort of performance profile that you would expect from this type of communication. If you've used the Force.com API today, you probably have a pretty good sense of what kind of performance you can expect to get out of it. The round trips for individual calls, of course, depends a lot on what you're doing. But generally, and you can look at this, for example, if you go to our trust.salesforce.com, general response times are in the low 100 milliseconds. So you can expect some of the same response times or better from VMforce, given the network topology.
That's a great question, and it comes up all the time. And this next question is really good because I know it's come from the Java developers out there. So where will system out print line go? In other words, will developers be able to tail logs? So I love these kind of technical questions.
Yeah, and the answer is that developers will be able to have their own custom logs. A typical VMforce application will have some standard logs that you know from Tomcat and from web servers. So you'll have those at your disposal. You don't have to recreate those. They will have logging that is specific to the VMforce service, which you potentially also can take advantage of, and you won't have to recreate. But then as a developer, you can create your own custom log. And that will end up in being accessible over a controller API that you can access both at a low level from a command line tool or programmatically, and we'll also provide consoles for accessing that. And ultimately, we plan to offer more services around this. Really, the whole point of VMforce is to allow us to build out services for the developer and administrator of an application and allow them to get easy ways of monitoring and diagnosing their production applications without having to build up a bunch of infrastructure for it themselves.
Yep. So I think it's kind of resonating in terms of Developers can do things that they're used to, especially in development, but then they certainly get the additional advantage of the services in the Force.com platform when deployed into the cloud. So I think that's perfect. So I think we've got time for about 2 more questions, and as I said, what we'll do is we'll collate all of these great questions, especially the ones that we haven't answered, and we'll add them to the FAQ that is online. You can get to it from developer.force.com/VMforce. The last 2 questions, these should be pretty quick ones. Can VMforce apps call web services written in Apex?
Yeah, and the answer to that again is yes. Right now in the demo that Quentin showed here, there's sort of nothing new, so we didn't show anything there. But you can connect to web services. You can say what you do is you write an Apex web service, you get a WSDL document, and then you can use Access or another framework to generate Java stubs and use them from your Java web application. You're free to do that inside VMforce as well. You can also use the web service connector toolkit that is part of the SDK provided by Salesforce, and we will develop additional ways of making it really easy for you to connect to your own custom web services in Salesforce. This could ultimately, we're looking at turning these web services into REST services as well. So that's another thing that's going to be possible.
So that use case was another one that we discussed on the first webinar, and I think I just kind of put a to-do for me that I think that would be a great demo or sample app that I could put together and kind of share with the community as well. So I think we have time for one more question. Can Ant/Maven tasks be run to script or automate Apex unit tests and deployments?
So I think, I'm not sure what this question means on the Apex side. As you know, Apex has its own testing framework. Every time you make a change to an Apex class, you can run tests, and it's sort of built into how Apex works. But for VMforce and for Java applications, we'll be providing a test framework as well, so that you can automate running your test suite for your application. And we're planning on giving you, it's not something that will come right at first, but it's something we really want to provide as well, is to give you a place where you can do some level of continuous integration for your applications as well. Again, the goal here is to remove the need for you to set up and manage any infrastructure on your own for your application development.
All right, I think we're pretty well coming up to time. I wanted to thank everybody, and Jesper in particular, for going through this webinar. And as I mentioned, this is kind of a really early sneak peek into some of the things that we can expect coming out of VMforce, as well as we kind of just brushed the surface on what the Force.com platform provides, and certainly recommend that you check out developer.force.com for more information. And stay tuned, especially for Spring One and Dreamforce. And thanks everybody for attending.